My parents told every employer in Atlanta that I was a thief. They systematically dismantled my life, ensuring I could not get hired for 2 solid years. My father, Desmond, looked me dead in the eye and said maybe now I would learn to respect them. They told every prominent business owner and church leader in our community that I had embezzled $50,000 from the family business. It was a lie, a calculated and vicious lie designed to protect their golden child, my sister Jasmine. But last week, I finally secured a job interview. The chief executive officer walked into the room, looked at me, and said, "Before we start, I need to give you this. Your grandmother left it with strict instructions." He handed me a sealed envelope dated 18 years ago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive the ultimate betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect you. I am Zuri, 28 years old, a forensic accountant by trade. Right now, I am sitting in the center of my dimly lit living room. The warm glow of the fireplace dances across the mahogany floors as I lean forward, holding a piece of history in my hands. If you could see me, you would see a woman who spent the last 2 years fighting just to afford groceries, blacklisted in the very city she calls home. The financial district of Atlanta is a tight-knit community, especially among our circles. When Beatrice and Desmond Jackson, prominent real estate moguls and pillars of the church, declare that their youngest daughter is a fraud, doors close, doors slam. Security guards escort you out of lobbies before you even reach the receptionist. I lost my apartment. I lost my reputation. I survived by doing remote offshore accounting under an assumed business name, hiding my identity just to pay for my basic survival. The turning point happened exactly 7 days ago. I had somehow landed an interview at Vanguard Financials, one of the most powerful asset management firms in the Southeast. I walked into their towering glass building expecting the usual routine. I expected the hiring manager to look at my resume, pause, excuse themselves, and then return with a fake smile to tell me they were moving in a different direction. That was the protocol whenever the Jackson family blacklist caught up to me. I wore my best tailored suit, the only one I had not sold, and sat in the boardroom preparing my defense. The heavy oak doors opened, but it was not a hiring manager who walked in. It was Sterling Davis, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Financials. Sterling is a formidable man, commanding respect without saying a single word. He sat across from me at the long conference table. He did not open my portfolio. He did not ask about my gap in employment. He simply reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick envelope made of heavy, cream-colored parchment. It was sealed with a dark red wax stamp bearing the crest of my late grandmother, Nana Josephine. Nana Josephine was the true architect of the Jackson family empire. She was a brilliant, fierce woman who built our real estate business from nothing back in the 1960s. She passed away when I was 10 years old. My parents always painted her as a sweet, but ultimately outdated woman who got lucky in business, claiming they were the ones who truly built the wealth. Sterling slid the envelope across the polished wood. He looked at me with an intensity that made the breath catch in my throat. He told me that his father was the personal attorney of Nana Josephine. 18 years ago, shortly before she passed, she handed his father this exact envelope. She gave him very specific, unwavering instructions. She told him to hold on to this until the day Beatrice and Desmond tried to destroy me. She knew. Even back then, when I was just a little girl, she saw the terrible greed festering deeply in my parents. She saw how they favored Jasmine, and she knew that one day my independence and my sharp mind would become a threat to their fragile egos. I stared at the envelope, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the aged paper. Sterling leaned back in his chair and told me I was not there for a job interview. He said Vanguard Financials had been watching my offshore accounting work. They knew I was brilliant. They knew I was the one catching financial discrepancies that their entire teams had missed. He told me I was already hired as the new regional director of forensic accounting, but more importantly, he was fulfilling a generational promise. I picked up the envelope. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. This was the moment everything was going to change. The red wax seal felt cold and heavy against my fingertips. I broke the seal, the ancient wax snapping with a sharp, satisfying sound that echoed in the quiet boardroom. The rich scent of old paper filled the air. Inside there were layers of yellow documents. I pulled out the first stack of papers. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, the signatures, the undeniable proof of what Nana Josephine had orchestrated. In a matter of seconds, my entire reality shifted. The papers in my hands were not just documents. They were a loaded weapon. They proved that my parents did not own the empire they paraded around Atlanta. They proved that every lie they told to ruin my life was about to become the very thing that dismantled theirs. I walked into that building as a blacklisted outcast, desperate and starving for a chance. I walked out of there holding the true keys to the absolute entire Jackson Kingdom. I stand up from the leather sofa, the ancient envelope still gripped tightly in my hand. I pace toward the grand fireplace in my living room, the warm light of the flames catching in my eyes, casting long shadows against the walls. For 2 years, my life was confined to small, dark spaces, hiding from the crushing weight of a ruined reputation. But not tonight. The heat radiating from the hearth mirrors the fire that ignited in my chest 48 hours after I walked out of Vanguard Financials. 2 days after Sterling Davis handed me the keys to my own redemption, I found myself standing at the bottom of the sweeping marble staircase of the Oak Trace Country Club. It was the night of my parents' 35th wedding anniversary gala. Beatrice and Desmond Jackson never missed a chance to turn their milestones into high society spectacles. They needed everyone in Atlanta's black elite to witness their wealth, to validate their status as royalty in the real estate world. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to park a continuous parade of luxury vehicles. Women in custom silk gowns and men in perfectly tailored tuxedos floated through the heavy oak doors, enveloped in the sounds of a live jazz quartet and the rich scent of expensive champagne. I walked up the steps, slowly adjusting the cuffs of my tailored emerald green dress. I held my head high, refusing to let the ghosts of my past dictate my posture. Every step felt heavy with the memory of how these people had turned their backs on me. Before I could even hand my coat to the attendant in the grand foyer, a manicured hand slammed flat against my chest, physically shoving me backward. It was Jasmine, my older sister, the former Howard University homecoming queen, the undisputed golden child of the Jackson family. She stood there dripping in diamonds that cost more than the rent I had struggled to pay for 24 months. Her perfect smile was replaced by a twisted sneer of pure disgust. "Who let the family thief?" in Jasmine's voice echoed loudly, intentionally slicing through the smooth jazz music. She did not lower her tone. She never did. She wanted the audience. She needed the surrounding church elders, the prominent business owners, and the wealthy socialites to turn and stare. "Did you come to steal from the open bar because nobody in Atlanta will hire you? You really have no shame showing your face here." Whispers erupted immediately. I saw Pastor Thomas, the man who had known me since childhood, shake his head in faux pity and turn his back. I saw former clients of my accounting firm whisper behind their crystal champagne flutes, judging me all over again. 2 years ago, this exact brand of public humiliation would have shattered me into a million pieces. I would have crumbled under the weight of their judgment, paralyzed by the shame of a crime I never committed. I would have run back to my car sobbing until I could not breathe, believing I truly was the outcast they said I was. But tonight, looking at Jasmine's triumphant, vicious face, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, lethal calm. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and she had no idea. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink away. I gently lifted my hand and brushed her fingers off my chest as if she were a piece of meaningless lint. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that instantly wiped the smirk off her face. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, pristine gold foil-stamped envelope. I held it up between us, making sure the light hit the embossed lettering perfectly. Jasmine scoffed, rolling her eyes for the benefit of the watching crowd. A fake invitation. Please. Mom and Dad would rather burn this venue to the ground than put a common criminal on their guest list. Security will be dragging you out in less than a minute. You always were desperate for attention. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, forcing her to look down at the official seal on the heavy cardstock. They did not invite me, Jasmine, I said, making sure my voice carried to the eavesdropping guests surrounding us. The country club board of directors did. Jasmine's arrogant posture faltered. Her eyes darted from the invitation to my face, a sudden flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her hostility. You see, I continued, keeping my gaze locked relentlessly on hers. Oak Trace Country Club is currently undergoing a massive federal financial audit. There seem to be some very interesting, highly illegal discrepancies in their capital expansion fund. Vanguard Financials was hired to oversee the entire investigation. I am the lead forensic auditor assigned to tear their books apart. The board of directors invited me tonight as a gesture of absolute transparency. They wanted to ensure the woman holding their financial fate in her hands felt warmly welcomed in their establishment. The air in the grand foyer seemed to vanish. The gossiping whispers stopped, entirely replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Jasmine's jaw tightened so hard, I thought her teeth might crack. An audit of their prestigious exclusive club was scandalous enough, but the fact that the disgraced younger sister, the woman they had all blacklisted and thrown to the wolves, was the executive leading the investigation was unthinkable. It was a total immediate shift in power. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I walked right past her, the heels of my shoes clicking with absolute authority against the polished marble floor. I felt the eyes of every single guest burning into my back, but this time they were not looking at a scapegoat. They were looking at a threat. But Jasmine was not the type to retreat gracefully. She spun around and grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin to stop me from entering the main ballroom. You think a fancy new corporate title erases what you are? She hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage and sudden panic. You are a criminal, Zuri. You stole $50,000 from our parents' safe. You belong in a jail cell, not a ballroom. You are nothing but a fraud, and I will make sure everyone here remembers that tonight. Before I could pry her desperate fingers off my arm and deliver my next strike, a heavy, arrogant voice cut through the tension from the ballroom entrance. Is there a problem out here, Jazz? Connor stepped through the heavy oak doors, a crystal tumbler of bourbon in his hand, and an arrogant smirk plastered across his perfectly shaved face. Connor was Jasmine's husband, a senior investment banker at a boutique Wall Street firm, and the man my parents practically worshipped. To Beatrice and Desmond Jackson, Connor was the ultimate prize. He brought corporate legitimacy and a shield of upper-crust privilege to the family portfolio. He loved to parade his wealth, and he loved nothing more than using that wealth to make other people feel incredibly small. He walked up from behind Jasmine and wrapped a protective arm around her waist. He pulled her close while eyeing me up and down like I was a stain on the country club's pristine marble floor. I can still feel the suffocating weight of that exact moment. As I stand here in my living room remembering it, the air feels heavy all over again. Imagine being completely surrounded by people who want nothing more than to see you fail. The high society guests crowded closer, their eyes gleaming with anticipation, eager to watch the disgraced daughter get publicly humiliated by the wealthy son-in-law. Connor played right to his audience. He knew the narrative my parents had spun. He fully believed I was a broke, desperate thief who had come to beg for scraps at the family table. A waiter in a crisp white tuxedo jacket approached our tenth circle carrying a silver tray. Resting on the tray was the bill for the VIP champagne service Jasmine and Connor had ordered for their friends before the gala officially began. Connor intercepted the waiter before the man could even speak. He snatched the black leather folio off the tray and casually tossed it right at my chest. The heavy leather hit my silk dress and landed on a small cocktail table beside me. The room went completely silent. Connor took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive bourbon. "Since you are here crashing the party?" he said, his voice dripping with intense condescension. Why do you not make yourself useful and cover the tip? He paused, leaning in closer, a nasty, victorious smile spreading across his face. Oh, wait, I forgot. You cannot even afford rent these days. Maybe you can wash the dishes in the back to pay it off. The surrounding crowd let out a collective synchronized gasp, followed by low, cruel chuckles. Jasmine beamed, looking at her husband like he was a conquering hero who had just slain a dragon. For 2 entire years, I had lived with the constant gnawing anxiety of deep poverty. I knew the specific heart-pounding terror of watching a bank account drop below zero. I knew what it felt like to choose between keeping the electricity on and buying a week's worth of groceries. Connor throwing a $5,000 champagne bill at me was designed to be the final crushing blow to my dignity. It was meant to remind me that in their glittering world, I was absolutely nothing. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to run away in tears. But I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single emotional reaction. I calmly unclasped my designer clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a card. It was not a standard piece of plastic. It was a solid metal black card, heavy and cool to the touch, carrying no spending limit whatsoever. I held it between my index and middle finger, letting the dim chandelier light catch the matte black finish. Then, with a quick, decisive flick of my wrist, I tossed it onto the leather folio. The heavy metal hit the table with a sharp, undeniable clink that echoed loudly and silenced the remaining chuckles in the room. The waiter, a seasoned professional trained to recognize the spending tools of the ultra-wealthy, immediately stepped forward. He did not hesitate or look to Connor for permission. He picked up the folio, bowed his head slightly to me, and walked straight over to the mobile payment terminal. The transaction was approved in less than 3 seconds. The machine printed the receipt with a rapid mechanical whir. Connor stared at the waiter, his smug expression instantly faltering. He let out a loud, harsh laugh that sounded completely forced and desperate. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice to ensure every single guest in the foyer could hear his loud accusation. "She is committing credit card fraud right in front of us," he announced, pointing an aggressive, accusing finger directly at my face. "You really are out of your mind, Zuri. Whose account did you hack to get that card? Did you steal another $50,000 from a brand new victim? You are going to leave this country club in handcuffs tonight." He stepped aggressively toward the returning waiter and snatched the receipt tray right out of the man's hands. He wanted to see the name on the card. He wanted to prove to the entire room that I was a fraud, a thief, a desperate imposter playing a dangerous game of dress-up. I stood perfectly still, a cold, calculated smirk finally breaking across my face. I watched his eyes rapidly scan the printed receipt. I watched the exact second his brain processed the information printed on the thermal paper. I watched the blood completely and utterly drain from his arrogant, flushed face, leaving him a pale, trembling mess. He looked at the receipt, then looked up at me, his eyes wide with sudden, absolute panic. I took a slow step forward, invading his space just as Jasmine had done to me minutes earlier. I pointed a single, perfectly manicured finger directly at the corporate entity printed in bold black ink at the very top of the receipt. "That is a corporate card." "Connor," I said, my voice low and lethal, cutting through the silence of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "Do you recognize the name of the holding company?" He could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. The corporate entity that had just effortlessly paid his $5,000 bar tab was Vanguard Financials. It was the massive parent company that fully owned the boutique Wall Street investment bank where he worked. He was a mid-level director playing with other people's money. I was the executive holding the financial reins of the corporation that signed his paychecks. I did not just outrank him. I owned his entire professional existence. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. Connor stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically from the heavy black metal card resting on the silver tray to my face. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as his Wall Street-trained brain scrambled to find a punchline, a deflection, or a dismissive insult that simply did not exist. He opened his mouth, but the arrogant smirk had completely vanished, replaced by the slack-jawed realization of a man who just stepped on a hidden landmine. I stepped even closer, invading his personal space. I squared my shoulders and lifted my chin, forcing him to physically lean back. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of the shadow I was casting over his carefully curated life. For 2 years, he and my sister had mocked my supposed failure at every family holiday I was not allowed to attend. Now I was the one holding the gavel. You and my parents honestly thought you starved me out, I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly off the high marble walls. Every guest in the foyer was hanging on to my every word. You thought blacklisting me in Atlanta meant I would just roll over, surrender, and disappear into poverty. But you all forgot one crucial detail about me, Connor. I am a forensic accountant. I specialize in finding money that arrogant people try to hide. When the local doors closed because of my parents and their vicious lies, I simply opened my laptop and went global. Connor tried to scoff, but the sound caught in his throat. Jasmine squeezed his arm, her diamond bracelets glittering under the chandelier, but she looked as terrified as he did. I spent the last 24 months building a remote offshore accounting firm. I continued pacing slowly in front of them, commanding the room with absolute authority. I untangled corporate fraud for international clients while you were busy drinking expensive bourbon on Daddy's dime. I built a firm so relentlessly efficient that Vanguard Financials did not just bring me in for a job interview. They acquired my entire operation last week. I am not crashing your little party. I am the new regional director of Vanguard's Southeastern Division. That card pays the bill because Vanguard owns the air you breathe. Connor's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The survival instincts of a cornered narcissist kicked in. He let out a loud, forced laugh, shaking his head, and looking around at the crowd, desperately trying to rally his audience back to his side. A regional director, he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. Please, Zuri, do not try to play us. Vanguard probably just bought a shell company and gave you a vanity title to hit some corporate diversity quota. You think you can walk in here, throw around a corporate credit card, and pretend you actually understand high-level investment banking. You do not know the first thing about how my firm actually operates. He took a step forward, trying to reclaim his physical dominance, trying to literally look down his nose at me. It was the exact opening I was waiting for. I did not blink. I did not step back. I let a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. A vanity title, I asked, lowering my voice to a dangerous conversational volume that forced the crowd to lean in to hear. Let us talk about your specific department, Connor. Let us talk about your derivatives portfolio in the commercial real estate sector. Q3 projected a 14% yield, but your actuals closed at a devastating negative 4.2%. You lost your clients millions. Yet miraculously, your Q4 bonus structure was approved based on a newly adjusted ledger. An adjusted ledger that showed a sudden, totally unverified influx of capital right before the fiscal year closed. The bourbon in Connor's crystal tumbler actually rippled. His hand was shaking violently. The deep red flush drained from his face entirely, leaving him the color of old parchment. Jasmine dropped her hand from his arm, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at her husband. How do you know those numbers? Connor breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Those are highly confidential internal metrics. Only the managing partners have access to the unadjusted Q3 ledgers. I told you, Connor. I am the auditor, I replied, my tone merciless and utterly calm. My team spent the last 72 hours tearing your boutique firm's books apart line by line before we even bothered looking at this country club. There is a massive, gaping, 7-figure discrepancy in your department's accounts. Phantom numbers generated out of thin air to cover your massive trading losses. A discrepancy that has your unique digital signature and authorization codes all over it. The crowd gasped. The socialites who had been laughing at me moments earlier were now staring at Connor as if he were radioactive. In their world, losing money was a sin, but getting caught committing federal financial fraud was an absolute death sentence. You are lying, Connor stammered, taking a stumbling step backward. You are making this up. You cannot access those files. You do not have the clearance. I have clearance over the managing partners. I corrected him smoothly. I have the power to freeze your assets, seize your hard drives, and terminate your employment with cause before dessert is even served tonight. You wanted me to cover a $5,000 tip. I am about to cost you your entire career, your freedom, and every single cent of that fraudulent bonus you used to buy my sister's diamond necklace. Total panic overtook him. The arrogant, untouchable Wall Street banker vanished, replaced by a terrified man caught in a trap he could not buy his way out of. He looked wildly around the foyer, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes bypassed Jasmine entirely and locked onto the grand double doors of the ballroom. He was looking for his protectors. He was looking for the only people in Atlanta powerful enough to shield him from the storm I just brought to his doorstep. Desmond Connor shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Beatrice!" The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Stepping through the heavy oak doors were my parents, Beatrice and Desmond Jackson. They were dressed in impeccable formal wear, the absolute picture of high society royalty. Desmond looked confused, but Beatrice's face was a mask of pure concentrated fury. She saw Connor trembling. She saw Jasmine looking completely humiliated, and then her eyes locked dead onto me. The matriarch of the Jackson family had arrived, and she was ready to go to war to protect her perfect image. My hands hung at my sides, my fingers curling inward until my nails bit sharply into my palms. My knuckles turned stark white under the ambient light of the chandelier. If anyone had bothered to look closely, they would have seen the immense physical restraint it took to hold my ground. But as I slowly tilted my head up to meet my mother's gaze, all the anger, all the hurt, and all the betrayal that had suffocated me for 2 years dissolved into a state of absolute lethal calm. I was no longer the frightened daughter begging for her family to believe her. I was the executioner, and court was officially in session. Beatrice Jackson did not miss a beat. She did not ask Connor what was wrong. She did not ask why her prized son-in-law looked like he was about to pass out on the marble floor. My mother was a master tactician of social warfare, and she knew exactly how to control a room. Seeing Connor's panic and my unwavering stance, she instantly went on the offensive. She took 3 rapid, aggressive steps toward me, her emerald silk gown swishing around her ankles. She inhaled deeply, her chest puffing out as she prepared to deliver a performance worthy of a stage. She intentionally raised her voice, pitching it perfectly so that it carried past the immediate circle and reached the ears of the surrounding HBCU alumni, the prominent politicians, and the affluent church elders who made up her prized social circle. She was ensuring that everyone in the grand foyer stopped breathing and turned their full attention to us. "How dare you threaten your brother-in-law?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured outrage. She pointed a trembling finger right at my face, her eyes wide with dramatic sorrow. "You stole $50,000 from our safe to fund your degenerate lifestyle. You are a disgrace to the Jackson name." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the synchronized gasps of the Atlanta elite. This was the exact lie she had whispered behind closed doors for 2 years to ruin my career, but hearing her scream it in public was a different kind of violence. She was weaponizing my alleged crime right in front of the people who held the keys to the city. Beatrice turned slightly, making sure the crowd could see the devastating pain etched across her carefully contoured face. She placed a hand over her heart, playing the ultimate tragic victim of a ruthless, ungrateful child. "Do you know what we had to do to survive what you did to us?" She cried out to the room, projecting her voice toward the church elders who were nodding in solemn sympathy. "We had to sacrifice everything to cover the gaping hole you left in our family business. We bled for you, Zuri. We shielded you from the police because you are our blood, and this is how you repay us. You come into our anniversary gala to harass the only decent man your sister has ever known." Jasmine immediately picked up on the cue. She buried her face into Connor's shoulder and let out a loud theatrical sob. Connor just stood there, completely paralyzed by the realization of his own impending doom, but my mother was far too caught up in her monologue to notice his lack of participation. Beatrice walked over and wrapped her arm protectively around Jasmine's trembling shoulders. She looked back at me with eyes full of venom. "Look at your sister!" Beatrice commanded, her voice cracking with fake emotion. Jasmine had to take out massive student loans just to survive because you drained our emergency funds. She had to struggle and suffer and stay awake at night worrying about her future, all because you wanted to live a lavish, selfish life. Jasmine is the dutiful daughter. She held this family together while you tore it apart. My father, Desmond, finally stepped forward. He stood next to Beatrice, shaking his head with a look of profound, sorrowful disappointment. He did not say a word, but his posture validated every single lie falling from my mother's lips. He looked at the crowd, offering them a silent, suffering smile that essentially said, "Look at the burden we carry." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder and much more hostile. I heard a prominent real estate developer whisper that I belonged in a penitentiary. I saw the wives of the deacons glaring at me with utter contempt. My mother had successfully painted a masterpiece of manipulation. She was the sacrificing matriarch, Jasmine was the innocent martyr, and I was the greedy, destructive monster who had come to ruin their beautiful night. They expected me to break. They expected me to yell, to scream, that it was not true, to beg the crowd to listen to my side of the story. They knew that if I raised my voice, I would just look like an unstable, hysterical liar. That was always their strategy. Push me until I reacted, and then use my reaction as proof of my guilt. But I did not defend myself. I did not utter a single syllable of denial. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, judgmental silence of the room wash over me. I looked at Beatrice, then at Desmond, and finally at Jasmine, who was currently peeking at me from behind Connor's shoulder to see if her tears were working. I offered them nothing but a slow, chilling smile. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I reached into the sleek black portfolio I had carried in with me. My fingers brushed past the thick, heavy parchment of Nana Josephine's envelope. I bypassed the legal declarations and pulled out the very first stack of documents I had found inside. I held the papers in my hand. They were not fresh printouts. They were slightly aged, stamped with official banking seals, and carried the heavy weight of undeniable federal-level proof. I looked at my mother, whose righteous anger was suddenly faltering as she stared at the documents in my grip. These were not just papers. They were a set of original, fully authenticated wire transfer receipts from exactly 3 years ago, and they were about to burn her entire fabricated reality straight to the ground. I did not hand the papers to my mother. I raised my hand and slammed the thick stack of wire transfer receipts directly onto the small cocktail table, burying Connor's $5,000 champagne bill under the weight of federal evidence. The sharp smack echoed through the foyer, making Jasmine physically flinch. $50,000, I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear to the back of the room. That is the exact amount you told the police, the church, and all of Atlanta that I stole from the family real estate business. You said I hacked the accounts to fund a degenerate lifestyle. But federal banking records tell a vastly different story. I tapped the top page with my index finger, tracing the highlighted routing numbers. These receipts show a direct authorized wire transfer from Jackson Real Estate Holdings. The money did not go to me. It went straight to the Howard University Greek Life Disciplinary Board. I turned my gaze to Jasmine, whose fake tears had instantly dried up, replaced by stark, paralyzing terror. Tell them, Jasmine, I demanded, my tone merciless. Tell Connor and the lovely church elders what you did during your senior year. You were the treasurer of your prestigious sorority, were you not? The golden girl who needed to keep up appearances, who needed designer bags and VIP tables to maintain her status as the queen of the campus. I did not wait for her to formulate another lie. She was trembling too hard to speak anyway. You embezzled $50,000 from your own sorority sisters, I announced to the room. You drained their national fund to buy your lifestyle, and you got caught red-handed. They were going to expel you in disgrace and press federal charges. I stepped away from my sister and turned my attention back to Beatrice and Desmond. They looked like statues, their faces drained of all color. You could not let that happen, could you, Mother? I asked, taking a slow step toward her. If your golden child caught a felony conviction, she would be ruined. She would be a social pariah. More importantly, she would never be able to secure a wealthy Wall Street husband to elevate the family portfolio. I looked over at Connor, making sure he was absorbing every single word. So you and Dad wired the money to quietly settle the debt and keep Jasmine out of a prison cell. But you had a massive problem. You used corporate funds from the family business, and the quarterly audit was coming up. You needed a scapegoat to explain the missing 50 grand to your investors. And who better than the younger sister who refused to play your shallow high society games? You framed your own daughter to protect your investment in the other. Beatrice's jaw was practically on the floor. Her perfectly painted lips trembled as she tried to form a coherent sentence. "Those are forgeries," she sputtered, her voice lacking its usual commanding pitch. It was the desperate squeak of a woman watching her empire burn. "You are making this up to ruin our anniversary. They carry the watermark of the Federal Reserve, Mother," I replied effortlessly, crossing my arms. "As I mentioned earlier, Vanguard Financials acquired my forensic accounting firm. I ran a complete audit on Jackson Real Estate Holdings using our proprietary software. You cannot hide digital footprints from me. I have the IP addresses, the authorization logs, and the email threads between you and the university dean discussing the cover-up." The grand foyer erupted into absolute chaos. Pastor Thomas, the man who had shaken his head in faux pity at me just 20 minutes ago, was now staring at Desmond with profound disgust. The prominent business owners and wealthy socialites were whispering furiously, their eyes darting between Beatrice and Jasmine with naked contempt. The pristine, untouchable Jackson legacy was disintegrating in real time, exposed as a shallow fraud built on theft and betrayal. Jasmine resorted to her only remaining weapon. She burst into violent, dramatic sobs. She reached out, trying to grab Connor's arm again, burying her face in her hands. "Connor, please," she wailed, tears streaking her flawless makeup. "I was just a kid. I was under so much pressure to be perfect for them. They forced me to keep up this impossible image. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake, and it is all in the past." But Connor did not pull her close. He did not shield her from the judging eyes of the crowd. Instead, he ripped his arm away from her grasp and took a large step backward. He looked at his wife with pure, unadulterated disgust. His Wall Street-trained brain was no longer focused on my Vanguard corporate card. It was frantically calculating the timeline I had just laid out. 3 years ago, Connor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. He was not looking at my parents. He was staring a hole right through Jasmine. "You embezzled $50,000 to avoid felony charges 3 years ago." Jasmine nodded frantically, completely misunderstanding the source of his anger. "Yes. Before we even met. It has nothing to do with us, Connor. My parents paid it back. It is completely gone." "You absolute idiot!" Connor hissed, his hands balling into tight fists. "It has everything to do with us." He stepped toward her, his face a mask of calculated fury. "We signed our prenuptial agreement 2 years ago. An ironclad Wall Street-mandated contract that required full sworn legal disclosure of all previous financial liabilities, debts, and criminal settlements. You signed a legally binding federal document swearing you had zero history of financial misconduct." Connor stared at Jasmine with a revulsion so pure it seemed to physically push her backward. In the high-stakes, ruthless environment of boutique investment banking, a lie on a federal financial disclosure or a prenuptial agreement was not just a red flag, it was an automatic termination of trust. He realized in that agonizing span of seconds that the pristine upper-crust Southern belle he had married was a massive financial liability. He shook his head, refusing to let Jasmine touch him, his eyes scanning the grand foyer as if looking for the nearest exit. The whispers of the gathered elite crescendoed into a loud, undeniable hum of judgment. Pastor Thomas was shaking his head while the prominent business owners who had done deals with my parents were exchanging deeply concerned glances. The Jackson family reputation, carefully cultivated over decades of church donations and charity galas, was disintegrating under the bright chandelier lights. I turned my back to the imploding scene. I walked away from Connor's panic and Jasmine's pathetic mascara-stained tears. Moving with a slow, relaxed grace, I strolled toward the grand mahogany bar cart, set up near the sweeping staircase. I could feel the eyes of every single guest tracking my movement, watching me glide across the marble floor with absolute unbothered control. I picked up a heavy crystal tumbler, The ice clinked sharply as I poured a generous splash of sparkling water. I took a slow sip, letting the carbonation burn the back of my throat, projecting a casual comfort that stood in stark contrast to the absolute terror consuming my family. Desmond Jackson realized the silence was killing them. The patriarch of the family, a man who had built his entire identity on control and respect, knew that denial was no longer an option. The authenticated federal wire receipts sitting on the cocktail table were a death sentence to their lies. If he could not deny the theft, he had to justify it. He had to shift the narrative back to a territory where he held the power. He had to use the ultimate weapon of a toxic, image-obsessed family: guilt. Zuri. That is enough, Desmond boomed. His deep baritone voice, the same one he used to command boardrooms and command respect from the church pews, echoed powerfully through the foyer. He stepped away from Beatrice and marched toward the center of the room, squaring his broad shoulders. I slowly turned around, leaning my hip against the edge of the bar cart, holding my glass and waiting for the inevitable spin. "We did what we had to do to protect the family image," Desmond declared, projecting his voice so the surrounding HBCU alumni and wealthy socialites could hear his profound, sacrificial reasoning. He looked at me not with apology, but with stern, righteous indignation. "You are a Jackson. You know what it takes to survive in this city. If the board of directors at Howard University had pressed federal charges against Jasmine, our entire family business would have been dragged through the mud. Our investors would have fled. The banks would have called in our loans. We were protecting our legacy." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he deployed his most twisted manipulation yet. He tried to weaponize my own resilience against me. "You were always the tough one, Zuri," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of false paternal reasoning. "You are the strong one. You have always been independent and capable. You could handle the bad reputation. You could handle the whispers and the closed doors. Jasmine could not." He gestured toward his weeping eldest daughter. "Look at her. She is fragile. She could not survive that kind of scandal. She would have broken. We made a hard choice, but we made the right choice for the family. You owe us respect for giving you life, for putting a roof over your head, and for keeping this family's name immaculate so you could even have a future to begin with." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the crowd. The sheer audacity of his logic hung in the air. He was openly admitting to sacrificing one child to save the other, framing it as a noble burden I should have been honored to carry. I set my crystal tumbler down on the bar cart. The soft clink of the glass was the only sound in the foyer. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet surgical precision that stripped away every ounce of his false nobility. "You did not protect the family image, Desmond," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, unwavering edge. "You protected your favorite investment. You told every accounting firm, every bank, and every corporate partner in Atlanta that your youngest daughter was a thief. You blacklisted your own flesh and blood to cover her tracks." I stepped away from the bar cart, walking slowly back toward the center of the room, closing the distance between us. "I was your daughter, and you let me starve." I continued, my gaze locking onto his, refusing to let him look away. "You sat in this massive estate drinking imported wine while I faced eviction notices for 24 straight months. I chose between electricity and groceries while you let Jasmine buy authentic Chanel bags and custom silk dresses. You sacrificed my entire future, my reputation, and my sanity, just so your fragile golden child could maintain her perfect little illusion and trap a Wall Street banker husband." Jasmine let out another wail, burying her face in her hands, completely unable to defend herself against the brutal, undeniable truth. Beatrice stood paralyzed, realizing that Desmond's attempt to play the guilt card had completely backfired, only making them look like ruthless, calculating monsters in front of their esteemed guests. But Desmond's pride would not allow him to back down. The patriarchal mask cracked, revealing the arrogant elitism underneath. He scoffed, a short, ugly sound of pure dismissal. "So what?" Desmond sneered, his chest heaving. as he looked down at me with absolute contempt. So you had to struggle for a couple of years. You survived, did you not? You got a fancy new corporate job and a metal credit card. Good for you, Zuri. But do not forget your place. He gestured expansively around the opulent foyer, pointing to the vaulted ceilings and the expensive artwork lining the walls. At the end of the day, we still own Jackson Real Estate Holdings. He proclaimed, his voice dripping with arrogant supremacy. We still own the commercial blocks downtown. We still hold the status in this city. You are just a corporate employee, Zuri. You have a fancy title, and you wear a nice dress, but you are nothing but a worker. We own this estate. We own our wealth. You have absolutely no legacy. I stopped walking. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of anger or defensiveness. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated anticipation. I looked at Desmond's puffed-up chest, then at Beatrice's terrified eyes, and finally at the embossed gold foil envelope resting quietly on the cocktail table next to Connor's unpaid bill. I did not say a word. I simply stepped past. My father walked over to the table and reached my hand deep into Nana Josephine's envelope for the second time. The ambient glow of the fireplace flickered against the crystal tumbler I had left on the bar cart. If anyone looked closely at the glass, they would see the dancing flames reflected in the condensation, a perfect mirror of the destruction unfolding in the room. I let a sharp, razor-thin smile touch my lips as my fingers wrapped around the next piece of evidence inside Nana Josephine's heavy parchment envelope. Connor was breathing heavily. His pristine tailored tuxedo suddenly looked suffocating. He yanked at his silk collar, his face flushing a deep, blotchy red. The whispers of the Atlanta elite were closing in on him. He was a sterling. He came from generational old money wealth, a family that prided itself on clean records and pristine associations. Being tied to a messy criminal scandal was his ultimate nightmare. He looked at Jasmine, who was currently curled in on herself, weeping into her hands, and his panic instantly transformed into vicious, self-preserving rage. "Get away from me!" Connor shouted violently, shoving Jasmine's hands away as she tried to reach for his jacket. He backed up, putting as much physical distance between himself and my family as possible. "Connor, please." Jasmine choked out her voice, barely a whisper. "I love you. It was a mistake." "A mistake," Connor bellowed, his voice cracking with hysteria. His eyes darted around the room, making sure the wealthy church elders and prominent politicians heard him clearly. "You are a criminal. You are all criminals. I am a vice president at a global investment bank. My family sits on the board of the country club. We have an immaculate legacy. I will not let my name be dragged through the mud because I married into a family of ghetto frauds." The racial undertone of his insult caused a collective gasp to ripple through the foyer. Desmond stiffened his chest, puffing out in offense, but Connor did not let him speak. Connor was on a relentless, frantic mission to save his own skin. "I am done," Connor declared, pacing back and forth, pointing an accusatory finger at my parents. "You lied to me. You presented yourselves as upstanding business leaders, but you are nothing but common thieves running a glorified scam. I am contacting my legal team the second I leave this house. Jasmine, I am filing for an immediate expedited divorce. I am completely voiding our prenuptial agreement based on extreme financial fraud. You will not get a single cent of my family's money." Jasmine let out a devastated wail, collapsing to her knees on the marble floor. Beatrice rushed to her side, glaring at Connor with venomous hatred, but Connor was already turning around. He smoothed down his tuxedo jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and lifted his chin, attempting to regain his aristocratic composure. He cast one final disgusted look at the weeping mess on the floor and turned on his heel, preparing to march out the grand front doors and leave the Jackson family to burn in the fire they had started. "Not so fast, Connor," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs and the sobbing with absolute authority. Connor froze in his tracks. He slowly turned his head, looking at me with a mixture of impatience and superiority. "I have nothing to say to you, Zuri," Connor spat, attempting to hold the moral high ground. I am a victim of their lies just as much as you are. I am washing my hands of this entire family. I pulled my hand out of the envelope. I was holding a small silver flash drive, but I kept it concealed in my palm for the moment. I walked toward him, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. "You are not a victim, Connor," I said, maintaining a steady, predatory gaze. "You are an investment banker. A very greedy, very reckless investment banker." Connor blinked, his false bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" I stopped 5 feet away from him. "Do you really think $50,000 simply moves from a corporate real estate account into a university disciplinary board checking account without raising massive red flags?" I asked, my tone dripping with academic condescension. A direct wire transfer of that size, clearly marked for embezzlement restitution, would have triggered an automatic internal audit at Jackson Real Estate Holdings. My parents are manipulative, but they are not incredibly financially literate. They needed help to move that money quietly. They needed someone who knew how to wash corporate funds. They needed you. Connor's face went completely ashen. The blotchy redness vanished, replaced by a sickly, terrifying pale hue. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I tracked the digital sequence I explained to the captivated audience. Vanguard Financials gave me access to unparalleled forensic software. I saw exactly how the money moved. Desmond and Beatrice did not wire the money directly to Howard University. They wired $50,000 to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a shell company registered under a fictitious LLC. From there, the money was broken down into 5 smaller transactions and funneled back into a domestic account. And guess whose routing number was attached to that domestic account? I took another step closer to him. He was visibly shaking now. "You used your executive banking credentials to launder the money, Connor," I stated loudly, making sure every single person in the foyer heard the accusation. "You washed the funds to keep your future wife out of prison, and you helped frame me to balance the corporate ledger. But you are a Wall Street man. You never do anything for free. You charged my parents a 20% processing fee for your illicit services. You pocketed $10,000 to ruin my life." "That is a lie!" Connor suddenly screamed, his voice pitching into a panicked shriek. He took a threatening step toward me, his hands raised. "You have no proof. You are making up financial jargon to drag me down with them. I am a sterling. I will sue you for defamation." I did not flinch. I slowly raised my right hand and opened my fingers. The small silver flash drive caught the light of the chandelier, gleaming like a weapon. "This flash drive contains the encrypted ledgers," I announced, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. "It contains your time-stamped logins, the offshore routing numbers, the IP addresses from your bank terminal, and the exact digital signature you used to authorize the transfers. It is a complete, undeniable map of federal money laundering and wire fraud." Connor stared at the flash drive as if it were a live grenade. He lunged forward, desperately trying to snatch it from my hand, but I smoothly stepped back, closing my fist around the silver drive. "Do not bother Connor," I said, flashing him that sharp, lethal smile. "This is just a backup copy. I already hit send on the original files 20 minutes before I walked through those front doors." Connor froze, his arms suspended mid-air, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. "The Securities and Exchange Commission already has the entire encrypted folder," I whispered, leaning in just enough so he could hear the finality in my voice. "The FBI White Collar Crimes Division was carbon copied on the email. Your career is over. Your family legacy is dead. You are going to federal prison." Connor did not utter another syllable. The threat of a defamation lawsuit died instantly in his throat, suffocated by the crushing reality of federal indictments. He stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping wildly on the smooth marble tile until his spine collided with one of the grand Roman pillars framing the entryway. He slid down the cool stone, his knees giving out completely. The immaculate, arrogant investment banker was reduced to a hyperventilating, paralyzed shell of a man clutching his chest as he stared into the void of his ruined future. He was not plotting a legal defense. He was watching his entire life disintegrate. The sprawling, opulent foyer suddenly felt incredibly claustrophobic. The physical space seemed to shrink, creeping inward, pressing tightly against the remaining members of the Jackson family. The surrounding audience of prominent politicians, wealthy developers, and church elders had stopped whispering. Their collective silence was heavier and far more suffocating than any spoken accusation. They were watching an empire collapse, and the air in the room grew thick with tension. Beatrice Jackson realized she was losing the crowd. With her prized son-in-law incapacitated on the floor and Jasmine still weeping uselessly into her hands, the matriarch knew she was the absolute last line of defense. Her husband's attempt at invoking family loyalty had failed spectacularly, making them look like calculating monsters. Beatrice pivoted to the only strategy she had left. She needed to manipulate the audience's morality. She needed to turn the distinguished guests into an angry mob. She stepped right over Connor's outstretched legs, ignoring his panic entirely, and marched toward the center of the room. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown through her shoulders back and locked eyes with Pastor Thomas, her face contorting into a masterclass display of manufactured agony. "Look at what she is doing!" Beatrice cried out, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical sorrow. She swept her arm toward me, her eyes pleading with the heavy hitters of Atlanta high society. "Look at the destruction she is causing. Zuri has always been a bitter, vindictive child. She was never as smart as Jasmine. She never possessed the grace or the social understanding required to carry the Jackson name. And now, out of pure, unadulterated jealousy, she is fabricating digital files to destroy a pillar of this community." Beatrice turned, working the room like a seasoned politician at a campaign rally. She made sure to make deliberate eye contact with the university deans and the city council members standing near the grand staircase. "Do not listen to the ravings of an unstable, jealous girl," Beatrice pleaded, placing both hands over her heart. "Think about who we are. Think about the Jackson Family HBCU Scholarship Fund. For over a decade, Desmond and I have bled for this city. We have poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the local community. We have paid the tuition for countless underprivileged Black youth. We have built futures. We have funded dreams. We are philanthropists who have dedicated our entire lives to uplifting our people." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger right at my chest, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "And this is how we are repaid," Beatrice shouted, ensuring her voice reached the deepest corners of the house. "By an ungrateful wretch who wants to tear down an institution of Black excellence just because she felt inadequate growing up. Are you really going to stand here and let this bitter girl slander a family that has done so much good for Atlanta?" Beatrice dropped the sorrowful mother act and shifted into sheer authoritative outrage. She glared at the men in the room, asserting her dominance, demanding the blind loyalty her wealth had always purchased. "I want her out," Beatrice commanded. "Pastor Thomas Marcus, somebody call security right now. Throw her out into the street where she belongs. I will not allow this jealous monster to defile the Jackson legacy for another second. Get her out of my house." She stood panting, her chest heaving, waiting for the crowd to act. She expected the deacons to step forward. She expected the security guards hired for the gala to rush in and drag me away by my arms. She expected her social capital to buy her immediate, unquestioning obedience. But no one moved. Not a single person in that grand foyer took a step toward me. The crowd was completely spellbound, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the secret spilling out onto the floor. Pastor Thomas simply looked away, adjusting his collar uncomfortably. The city council members kept their hands firmly in their pockets. Beatrice's social currency had officially bounced. I did not blink. I did not move to defend myself against her vicious character assassination. I simply looked at my mother with eyes completely devoid of warmth, empathy, or hesitation. While she stood there desperate for an ally that was never going to come, I grabbed the edge of Nana Josephine's thick parchment envelope. I broke the second heavy wax seal. The crisp snap of this cracking wax sounded like a gunshot in the dead silent room. I reached my hand deep inside the envelope, bypassing the remaining bank statements and printed audit logs. My fingers brushed against something thick, worn, and incredibly old. I gripped it tightly and pulled it out into the harsh, bright light of the chandelier. It was not a printed spreadsheet. It was not a modern digital log or a bank receipt. It was a physical leather-bound accounting ledger. The spine was cracked and faded, the edges of the thick paper yellowed with age and heavy use. The gold foil lettering on the front cover had mostly rubbed off over the decades, but the embossed initials J.M. were still clearly visible. I held the weathered book up for the entire room to see. I watched Beatrice's eyes track the movement, and the exact moment she recognized the worn leather binding, the last drop of blood drained from her face. She let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she took a terrified step backward. "You love talking about the origin of the Jackson family legacy." "Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling whisper that carried perfectly across the marble floor. "You love bragging to these people about the massive wealth you and Dad supposedly built from the ground up through hard work and philanthropy. But Nana Josephine kept meticulous handwritten records, and this ledger from exactly 18 years ago proves exactly whose blood you spilled to buy this estate." I held the book with both hands, letting the heavy, undeniable truth of it anchor me to the floor. Beatrice was practically vibrating with terror. She knew exactly what this was. Everyone in the inner circle knew about Nana Josephine's infamous master ledger, though my parents had spent the better part of 2 decades convincing themselves they had successfully destroyed it after she passed away. They had burned boxes of her files, shredded her tax returns, and wiped her digital footprint clean. But Nana was a woman who survived the Jim Crow South by keeping her receipts. She hid the true physical ledger, and I was the only one who had bothered to look where she told me to look. I cracked the weathered leather cover open. The dry, aged pages let out a crisp sound that echoed across the silent room. I began to walk in a slow, deliberate circle, my eyes scanning the crowd as I moved, making myself the undeniable center of gravity in the room. The entire foyer seemed to revolve around me. I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. "Let us talk about philanthropy." "Mother," I began, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "Let us talk about this famous HBCU scholarship fund you just tried to use as a shield. You and Dad love to stand at podiums and accept community service awards. You love giving tearful speeches about how you built this charity from nothing, how you pulled yourselves up by your bootstraps. But page 1 of Nana's ledger tells the actual unedited origin story." I ran my finger down the faded ink of the first page, stopping at a prominent date stamped in the top corner. Nana Josephine founded Jackson Real Estate Holdings in 1985. I read aloud, projecting my voice so the city council members and the church deacons in the back heard every syllable. She bought the first 3 commercial blocks downtown with her own savings, and she established the Jackson Family HBCU Scholarship Fund. The very next year, she endowed it with $2 million of her hard-earned money. You did not build anything, Beatrice. You inherited an empire built by a woman far better, far smarter, and far more generous than you will ever be. Beatrice swallowed hard, taking another step back until she bumped into a waiter who was frozen in shock holding a tray of champagne. "That is ancient history." Desmond snapped, his voice tight and defensive, trying to regain a sliver of his shattered authority. He stepped in front of his wife, his chest puffed out. "We took over the fund when she got sick. We expanded it. We managed the wealth and kept the donations flowing." I flipped forward to a section near the middle of the book, cross-referenced with modern banking printouts I had tucked between the yellowed pages. "Did you?" I asked, my tone dripping with lethal sarcasm as I continued my slow circle around the room. "Because according to Nana's final entries and the forensic banking audit I pulled last week, you and Beatrice have not deposited a single legitimate cent into that scholarship fund in 10 years. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Pastor Thomas, who sat on the board of the scholarship committee, stepped forward, his face flushed with sudden righteous anger. The silver cross around his neck caught the light as his chest heaved. "What are you saying, Zuri?" the pastor asked, his voice shaking with dread. "I am saying, Pastor Thomas, that my parents are parasites," I declared, stopping my pacing to look directly into the clergyman's eyes. I flipped to a page overflowing with highlighted bank routing numbers. The HBCU fund was supposed to distribute $100,000 annually to Black youth in Atlanta. But starting in 2014, the disbursements magically dropped to barely $20,000 a year. The rest of the money, the other $80,000 meant for struggling students trying to better their lives, was quietly funneled into a private offshore trust controlled entirely by Beatrice and Desmond. I turned my gaze back to my mother, who was now trembling so violently I thought she might collapse right there on the marble floor. "You stole from your own community," I said, my voice rising in volume and intensity. "You siphoned charity money meant to send kids to college, and you used it to fund your country club memberships. You used it to buy the imported Italian marble for this very foyer. You used it to lease those luxury cars parked in the driveway." And Jasmine, I pivoted toward my sister, who was still slumped on the floor, staring up at me with hollow, terrified eyes. "How do you think you afforded those extravagant summer trips to Paris and Milan?" I asked her, my voice dropping to a ruthless, piercing whisper. "How do you think you paid for the VIP tables, the spa weekends, and the designer wardrobes you absolutely needed to impress Connor's rich friends? You did not earn a dime of that money. Dad and Mom stole it from Black teenagers who needed it to buy textbooks and pay for meal plans just so you could pretend to be a Southern aristocrat. You wore stolen tuition money on your back for an entire decade." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The quiet murmurs of shock transformed into a roaring wave of absolute outrage. These were HBCU alumni. These were people who prided themselves on uplifting their community, people who donated their own hard-earned money to that exact fund. Hearing that the Jackson family had systematically robbed a scholarship fund to pay for luxury vacations was the ultimate unforgivable sin. Pastor Thomas looked at Desmond as if he were looking at the devil himself. "You disgust me," the pastor said, his voice booming with biblical fury. "You sat in my church, you prayed with my congregation. You shook my hand and you stole from our children to buy your sports cars. You are a disgrace to this community, Desmond. Both of you are." The prominent real estate developers who had been whispering about my alleged crimes just an hour ago were now actively backing away from my parents. The wealthy socialites who had flanked Beatrice all night, drinking her champagne and complimenting her dress, were staring at her with pure, unfiltered revulsion. The social execution was complete. The pristine Jackson family image, curated over decades of lies and strategic charity, had shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of minutes. One by one, the guests in the grand foyer did the most damning thing possible. They turned their backs. Pastor Thomas turned around first, followed by the city council members, and then the business elite. It was a silent, synchronized movement of total excommunication. Beatrice let out a pathetic, suffocated sob, finally sinking to her knees next to Jasmine, hyperventilating as she realized she was officially a pariah in the only city she cared about. She had lost her crown, her status, and her audience. Desmond stood alone in the center of the room. The crowd had turned away. His favorite daughter was a verified criminal. His son-in-law was fleeing the premises to avoid federal prison, and his wife was having a total breakdown on the floor. He was completely, inescapably cornered. But men like Desmond Jackson never surrendered gracefully. When their social currency ran out, they pivoted to brute force. His face morphed into a mask of pure, ugly desperation. The sophisticated patriarch vanished, leaving behind a cornered animal. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and yanked out a folded, notarized legal document. He held it up in the air, his hand shaking with furious adrenaline. "Turn your backs all you want," Desmond roared at the crowd, his voice echoing with manic hostility. "You think this means anything? You think a dusty old ledger changes who actually controls the money?" He turned back to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, waving the thick legal paper in my direction like a sword. "You think you won Zuri?" He snarled, a vicious, triumphant smirk cracking through his absolute panic. "You think bringing out your dead grandmother's diary strips me of my power? I hold the keys to the kingdom." I hold the absolute irrevocable power of attorney over Josephine Jackson's entire original estate. I had her sign it right before she lost her mind. I control the holding company. I control the trust. I control every single asset tied to this family. I am legally untouchable, and there is not a single thing you, the church, or the federal government can do about it. He brandished the thick, notarized document above his head, his face contorted into a mask of pure, rabid desperation. If anyone had been sitting on the floor looking up at him, they would have seen a man trying to inflate himself to terrifying proportions, a towering figure whose shadow was rapidly shrinking. His chest heaved with violent, erratic breaths as he gripped the piece of paper so tightly his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The veins in his neck bulged, pulsing against his stiff collar. He was no longer the composed, sophisticated patriarch of Atlanta high society. He was a trapped predator lashing out at the only threat in the room. This piece of paper gives me absolute, unquestionable authority over the Jackson estate. Desmond screamed, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of his own hysteria. He took a heavy stomping step toward me, jabbing his finger in the air. Josephine signed this over to me. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew I was the only one who could multiply her wealth and build this family into a dynasty. This gives me the legal right to manage the trusts, liquidate the assets, and handle the charitable foundation however I see fit. And more importantly, it gives me the right to excise anyone who threatens this family. He turned his wild gaze to the security guards stationed near the heavy oak doors. Two large men in black suits stood frozen, unsure of how to handle the implosion of their wealthy employer. "Arrest her," Desmond commanded, pointing directly at my face. "Arrest her right now. She is committing corporate espionage. She illegally hacked into our private financial servers, stole classified banking data, and is currently trying to extort us in front of our guests. Restrain her and call the police." The guards exchanged a nervous, hesitant glance. They took a slow, reluctant step forward. "And as for you, Zuri," Desmond spat his upper lip, curling into a sneer of pure venom. "I am exercising my legal right as the executor of this estate to cut you out completely. You are permanently, irrevocably disinherited. You will not see a single dime of the Jackson money. You will not touch the properties, the stock portfolios, or the family accounts. You are nothing to us. You are a bitter, jealous little girl who could not handle the fact that we chose your sister to carry our legacy." Jasmine sobbed louder from the floor, but Desmond ignored her, his eyes locked onto mine with a manic, triumphant glare. He thought he had found his trump card. He thought the legal jargon and the threat of law enforcement would make me cower and apologize just like it had when I was a child. He expected me to break under the weight of his absolute authority. I did not break. I did not even flinch. I stood perfectly still, letting his threats wash over me like a light, meaningless breeze. Before the security guards could take another step toward me, a sharp, resonant sound cut through the suffocating tension in the foyer. It was the distinct clink of a heavy crystal tumbler being placed firmly onto a marble side table. The noise came from the darkest corner of the room near the sweeping mahogany staircase. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, making way for a tall, impeccably dressed man who had been quietly observing the entire catastrophe from the shadows. Sterling Davis moved with the kind of effortless, silent power that commanded immediate, absolute respect. As the chief executive officer of Vanguard Financials, he was a titan in the banking world. He controlled billions of dollars in global assets. He was the man who approved or denied the very loans my parents used to sustain their lavish lifestyle. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, his face an unreadable mask of cold, calculating intelligence. Desmond's triumphant sneer vanished instantly. His arm dropped slowly to his side, the notarized document suddenly looking very flimsy in his grip. Sterling Desmond stammered, his voice instantly losing its booming authority. "I did not realize you were standing back there. Please excuse this ridiculous spectacle. My daughter is simply having a mental break. We are handling it." Sterling ignored Desmond completely. He walked right past the sweating patriarch and stopped beside me. He looked at the heavy leather-bound ledger in my hands, then offered me a slow, deeply respectful nod. She is not having a mental break, Desmond Sterling said, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of warmth. She is demonstrating the finest piece of forensic accounting I have seen in my entire career. Sterling turned to face the crowd, projecting his voice with practiced corporate ease. Zuri did not hack into your servers, he announced, destroying Desmond's desperate lie in a single breath. She did not commit corporate espionage. I granted her unrestricted high-level clearance to Vanguard's internal auditing software. She brought her suspicions to my office 3 weeks ago. She laid out a brilliant, undeniable hypothesis regarding offshore money laundering and the embezzlement of charity funds. I gave her the tools to prove it, and she executed the investigation flawlessly. A murmur of fresh shock rippled through the gathered elite. The fact that the CEO of Vanguard Financials was openly backing my investigation destroyed the last remaining shred of my parents' credibility. Beatrice let out a low moan, burying her face in her hands. Sterling turned his cold, piercing gaze back to my father. He extended his hand, his palm facing upward. "Let me see that document," Desmond Sterling demanded. Desmond clutched the paper to his chest, shaking his head rapidly. "This is a private family legal matter, Sterling. It is none of Vanguard's business. This is my power of attorney. It is ironclad." Sterling did not withdraw his hand. "I am highly familiar with that specific document, Desmond," he said, his tone dropping to a dangerous, lethal level. "I recognize the notary seal from here. I know the exact date it was signed, and I know exactly who drafted it." Desmond took another step back, his back hitting the Roman pillar again. "How could you possibly know that? Because the attorney who drafted that document was my father, Marcus Davis." Sterling revealed his words, dropping like heavy stones into the quiet foyer. He was Josephine Jackson's personal lawyer for 40 years. He handled her entire estate, her properties, and her philanthropic endowments. He was the one who sat in her hospital room when she was sick. Sterling took a step toward my father, closing the distance, trapping him against the stone pillar. "I know my father drafted that power of attorney when Josephine first fell ill." Sterling continued, his voice echoing with absolute damning certainty. "But I also know what my father did 3 months later, right before she passed away. When Josephine realized you were quietly moving money out of the scholarship fund, she called my father to her bedside. She completely and legally revoked that power of attorney. She stripped you of all executive control and placed the entire estate into a blind trust to be released only to her youngest granddaughter, Zuri, when she reached the age of 25. Sterling leaned in, his eyes locking onto Desmond's terrified face. "My father filed the revocation with the state 18 years ago." Sterling stated, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "That piece of paper you are waving around is completely null and void. You have been operating this company, signing bank documents and draining charity funds using a legally dead forged document for nearly 2 decades. You do not own this estate, Desmond. You are trespassing on it." Desmond's knees finally buckled. The forged power of attorney fluttered from his trembling fingers, drifting down to rest against the polished marble floor like a discarded piece of trash. He looked from Sterling to me, his mouth opening and closing, silently gasping for air that his lungs suddenly refused to process. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch, who had commanded boardrooms and terrified me as a child, was entirely gone. In his place was just a terrified, broken man, realizing he had spent 2 decades building a glass castle on quicksand. The crowd was dead silent. The only sound in the grand foyer was the harsh, ragged breathing of my mother as she remained crumpled on the floor next to Jasmine. I did not offer them a single ounce of pity. I looked down at the heavy parchment envelope still resting in my left hand. There was one final thick wax seal remaining on the flap. The deep crimson wax bore the distinct crest of the Davis law firm, a symbol of unbreakable legal authority. I lifted my hands, bringing the envelope into the direct, harsh light of the chandelier. I dug my thumb under the edge of the hardened wax. I pressed down with deliberate force, breaking the third and final seal. The sharp, decisive crack echoed through the foyer, a brilliant, beautiful sound signaling the absolute end of the Jackson family illusion. I reached inside the heavy paper and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy dark silk ribbon. The pages were pristine, perfectly preserved, and completely lethal. I held the stack up high. This is the true legally binding final will and testament of Josephine Marie Jackson. I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the room, drafted, witnessed, and filed 18 years ago by Marcus Davis. I looked at my father, who was staring at the document with wide, bloodshot eyes, sweat dripping down his temples and staining his expensive silk collar. "Nana Josephine loved you, Desmond," I said, walking slowly toward him, closing the distance until I was standing firmly in his personal space. But she was never blind. She built this empire from nothing, and she knew exactly what kind of man she had raised. She saw your greed. She saw your absolute obsession with societal status and high society approval. She knew that you would do anything, lie to anyone, and steal from any source to maintain the illusion of your own perfection. And most importantly, she knew exactly how you and Beatrice viewed me. I stopped right in front of him, forcing him to look at the daughter he had just tried to publicly discard. She knew I was the only one in this house who did not care about country club memberships or designer labels. I continued, my voice steady and unforgiving. She knew I was the scapegoat. She knew that the second your reckless spending caught up with you, you would sacrifice me to save yourselves and your precious golden child. She told me once that your vanity would eventually be your undoing. She just wanted to make sure I had the weapon to finish the job when the time came. I untied the silk ribbon, letting it fall to the floor alongside Desmond's forged document. I flipped open the heavy pages of the will. The legal jargon was dense, but the specific section I had memorized for years was highlighted in bold, undeniable print. Nana did not just leave the estate in a blind trust for me, I explained, turning to face the crowd of captivated guests, church elders and university officials. She knew that you might try to fight the trust in court. She knew you might try to drain the accounts or manipulate the board of directors before I turned 25. So she and Marcus Davis built a failsafe into the very foundation of Jackson Real Estate Holdings, a contingency plan designed for this exact night. I looked back at my father. He was gripping the Roman pillar behind him with both hands to keep from collapsing entirely, his chest heaving as panic seized his entire nervous system. In corporate law, it is called a poison pill, I said, a slow, razor-sharp smile spreading across my face. It is a defensive strategy used to prevent a hostile takeover, but Nana customized hers for a hostile family. I looked down at the document and began to read aloud, ensuring my voice carried to the furthest corners of the grand entryway. Section 4, Paragraph B. The accountability clause I read, enunciating every word with lethal precision. In the event that Desmond Jackson or Beatrice Jackson are found to have committed any act of fraud, embezzlement, or financial misconduct regarding the Jackson Family HBCU Scholarship Fund, a legal trigger is immediately activated. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd again. They understood exactly what this meant. The ledgers I had already exposed proved the embezzlement beyond any reasonable doubt. The condition had been met. But wait, there is more, I said, raising my hand to quiet the room. The clause has a second alternative trigger. I looked directly at Desmond, my eyes cold and hollow. Or in the event that Desmond Jackson publicly disowns, disinherits, or attempts to legally sever ties with my granddaughter Zuri Jackson, the identical legal trigger shall be activated. I snapped the document shut. The sound was like a gavel striking a wooden block. "You hit both triggers in a single night, Desmond," I whispered, stepping within inches of his sweating face. "You stole from the charity, and not 10 minutes ago you stood in front of 50 prominent witnesses and screamed that I was permanently, irrevocably disinherited. You activated the poison pill." Desmond's mouth opened, but only a dry, raspy wheeze came out. He was completely out of moves. The arrogance that had fueled his entire existence had been surgically removed, leaving behind an empty, terrified shell. "What does the trigger do?" Pastor Thomas asked, stepping forward from the crowd, his voice tight with anticipation. "What did Josephine put in that will?" I turned to the pastor, holding the document tightly against my chest, feeling the absolute power of my grandmother's foresight radiating through my veins. It is a total, irrevocable asset forfeiture, Pastor Thomas, I said, my voice steady and ringing like a bell of doom in the cavernous space. Nana Josephine knew that if my father ever compromised the integrity of her life's work, he could not be trusted with a single penny of it. She built a legal guillotine into the foundation of this family, and she handed me the rope. I opened the heavy parchment document and read the final devastating paragraph, projecting every syllable so that no one in the room could deny the reality of what was happening. Upon the activation of the aforementioned triggers, all executive control voting shares and equity within Jackson Real Estate Holdings are immediately and permanently revoked from Desmond and Beatrice Jackson. The management of the HBCU Scholarship Fund is stripped from their authority. Furthermore, all physical properties, liquid assets, and real estate holdings tied to the corporate trust are immediately seized and transferred in their entirety to the sole remaining beneficiary in good standing. I closed the leather-bound folder with a sharp, resonant thud. That beneficiary is me, I stated, looking directly into my father's eyes. The physical space between us seemed to expand, pulling back rapidly to reveal the collective horror painted across the faces of my entire family. Desmond's jaw hung slack, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked jerks. Beatrice gripped her own throat, her breathing ragged, her expensive emerald gown suddenly looking like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Jasmine stared at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes, her tear-streaked makeup completely forgotten. The entire room of Atlanta's elite watched in stunned silence as the Jackson dynasty was legally and surgically vaporized. "No!" Desmond gasped, shaking his head violently as he pushed himself off the Roman pillar. "No, that is impossible. You cannot just take everything. This house," he stomped his foot hard against the imported marble floor. "This estate is mine. It is in my name. I bought this land. You cannot take my home." "You did not buy this land," Desmond Sterling. Davis interjected, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. His voice was calm, carrying the absolute chilling authority of a man who controlled global markets. "The bank bought this land, and you were foolish enough to use the corporate trust as collateral." Desmond froze, his eyes darting frantically between me and the CEO of Vanguard Financials. "Let me explain the legal trap you just walked into, Father," I said, taking a slow step toward him. "You took out a massive mortgage to build this country club estate. You wanted the vaulted ceilings, the sweeping staircases, and the crystal chandeliers to impress your social circle. But you did not have the liquid cash to afford it, so you leveraged Jackson Real Estate Holdings to secure the loan from Vanguard Financials." Sterling adjusted his jacket and looked at my father with pure corporate disdain. "Standard lending agreements carry very specific stipulations," Desmond Sterling explained. "When a borrower commits federal fraud, money laundering, or embezzlement, the lending institution has the immediate right to call the debt in full. Because you have breached the morality contract of the original trust, the trust is now in default under your name. However, since the true legal ownership of the trust has just reverted to Zuri, Vanguard is exercising its right to transfer the deed and all associated debt structures directly to the rightful owner." I smiled, watching the last flicker of hope die in my father's eyes. "As of 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Vanguard Financials is officially transferring the deed of this estate to me," I announced. "I own the corporate accounts. I own the commercial blocks downtown. I own the management rights to the scholarship fund. And I own the very ground you are standing on. You are not the patriarch of a real estate empire, Desmond. You are a squatter in my house." Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She lunged forward, grabbing Desmond by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. "Do something!" Beatrice shrieked, shaking him violently. "Call our lawyers. Call the judges. You told me we were protected. You told me she could never touch us. Tell them to arrest her." Desmond simply stared straight ahead, completely paralyzed. There were no lawyers left to call. The man who had drafted the only document protecting them had been dead for a decade, and the son of that lawyer was currently standing in their foyer executing their financial ruin. They had absolutely nothing. The bank accounts were frozen. The offshore funds were being tracked by the federal government. The community they had manipulated for years was standing in the very same room watching their destruction with disgusted approval. They were utterly, entirely broke. Jasmine realized it before her parents did. The golden child, the sister who had happily worn stolen tuition money on her back and laughed while I chose between electricity and groceries, finally understood the magnitude of her reality. Connor was gone. He had publicly divorced her and was currently fleeing the state to save himself from federal indictments. Her prestigious Wall Street marriage was dead. Her family's wealth was an illusion. The designer dress she was wearing belonged to a trust fund she no longer had access to. She was facing immediate, crushing poverty. Jasmine let out a broken, animalistic sob and crawled across the marble floor. She dragged herself toward me, her expensive silk dress bunching around her knees. She stopped at my feet and dropped her head, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable weeping. "Zuri, please," Jasmine begged, her voice raw and pathetic. "Please, I am sorry. I am so sorry. I did not know how bad it was. I did not know they were stealing from the charity. Connor left me. He took my credit cards. He took the car. I have nothing. I do not have a house. I do not have a husband. I am completely broke. Please, Zuri. You are my sister. Do not put me out on the street. Please forgive me." I looked down at the weeping, trembling woman at my feet. The sister who had smiled when I faced eviction. The sister who had let me take the blame for her crimes. She was kneeling on my floor begging for a mercy she had never once shown me. I looked down at the weeping, trembling woman at my feet. The sister who had smiled when I faced eviction. The sister who had let me take the blame for her crimes. She was kneeling on my floor begging for a mercy she had never once shown me. If a lens had been slowly arcing around Jasmine in that exact moment, capturing her from every angle, it would have recorded a portrait of absolute, unvarnished ruin. The sweeping, midnight blue silk of her designer gown was soaked with spilled champagne and wrinkled beneath her knees. Her perfectly styled hair hung in damp, chaotic strands across her face. The heavy diamond-encrusted necklace she wore, catching the harsh light of the chandelier, suddenly looked less like jewelry and more like a heavy, suffocating collar. She was a woman completely stripped of her curated identity, reduced to a hollow, frantic creature clawing at the expensive leather of my shoes. I did not move a single muscle. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer a hand to help her up. I simply stared at her, my face a mask of impenetrable stone, letting the crushing weight of my silence press down on her fragile shoulders. Jasmine looked up, her bloodshot eyes searching my face for even a flicker of sibling affection, a trace of the sisterly bond she had spent her entire life stepping on. She found nothing. She saw the absolute frigid finality in my eyes. She realized in that breathless second that I was not going to save her. I was not going to write her a check, and I was not going to let her live in the house she had just spent the evening parading around as her own. Survival is an ugly, feral instinct. When the pampered and entitled realize the ship is sinking, they do not help row, they look for someone to throw overboard. Jasmine's desperate sobbing abruptly stopped. A new terrifying kind of panic hardened her features. She let go of my shoes and pushed herself up onto her knees, twisting her body to look directly at Beatrice and Desmond. Her chest heaved, her hands balling into tight fists at her sides. "It was them!" Jasmine screamed, the raw, piercing sound tearing through the silent foyer. Beatrice flinched as if she had been physically struck, her hands dropping from her face. Desmond stared at his eldest daughter in muted horror. "Do not look at me like that!" Jasmine shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at our mother. "Do not act like you are innocent, Zuri. It was their idea. The $50,000 missing from the corporate accounts 5 years ago. The money they said you stole, I took it. I took it to pay for the country club initiation fees and the wardrobe I needed to impress Connor's parents. I was terrified of losing him and I overdrew the accounts. But I did not frame you, Zuri. They did." A violent wave of murmurs crashed through the crowd of onlookers. Pastor Thomas closed his eyes and bowed his head, muttering a prayer for the absolute depravity unfolding before him. Sterling Davis stood beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the implosion with cold, clinical fascination. Jasmine was practically vibrating with venom, pouring out every ugly secret she had kept buried for years in a frantic bid to buy my forgiveness. I went to Dad crying. Jasmine confessed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I told him I made a mistake. And he is the one who said we should pin it on you. He said you were already asking too many questions about the scholarship foundation. He said you were too independent, too smart, and too stubborn to control. He hated that you refused to play the game, Zuri. He hated that you would not smile for the cameras and pretend we were this perfect, flawless dynasty. Jasmine scrambled to her feet, stumbling slightly in her heels as she advanced on our parents. Mom agreed with him instantly. Jasmine yelled, her voice breaking under the strain of her own hysteria. She said it was the perfect excuse to finally cut you off. She said you were a liability to the family image, and framing you for the theft would permanently discredit you. If you ever tried to tell anyone about the missing charity money, no one would believe a daughter who had been disowned for stealing from her own parents. They sacrificed you, Zuri. They threw you to the wolves because they were terrified of you. The absolute devastating irony of the moment hung heavy in the air. Desmond and Beatrice Jackson had spent their entire lives cultivating the perfect family image. They had ruthlessly pruned their family tree, cutting me off to protect their pristine, compliant golden child. They had poured all their love, their stolen resources, and their societal ambitions into Jasmine. And now the very daughter they had sacrificed my life to protect was publicly and brutally tearing them to shreds to save her own skin. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless cry, reaching out toward her eldest daughter. "Jasmine, stop!" Beatrice begged, her voice trembling with absolute devastation. "Please, you do not know what you are saying. We did everything for you. We gave you everything." "You gave me nothing!" Jasmine roared back, her face twisted with a resentment that had clearly been festering for decades. "You turned me into a useless, superficial puppet. You taught me that the only thing that mattered was money and what people thought of me. You made me weak so you could control me, and you punished Zuri because she was strong, and now I have nothing. Connor is gone, the money is gone, and it is entirely your fault." Jasmine spun back around to face me, her eyes wide and pleading, hoping that her vicious betrayal of our parents had somehow earned her a place by my side. She reached out, her trembling fingers inches from my arm. "I told you the truth," Zuri Jasmine whispered, her voice pathetic and small. "I told everyone what they did to you. Please, you have to help me. I am your sister." I looked at her outstretched hand. I looked at the smeared makeup, the ruined dress, and the desperate hollow eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering sibling affection. There was no pity for the woman who had happily watched me suffer while she wore diamonds bought with stolen funds. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. Jasmine's hand fell, hitting her side with a dull slap. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. Throwing our parents under the bus had not saved her. It had only cemented her as a traitor who would turn on anyone to survive. She was completely alone. I turned my head, dismissing her existence entirely. My gaze shifted past the weeping, broken golden child and locked onto the two people who had engineered this entire nightmare. Desmond and Beatrice stood frozen against the Roman pillar, their empire gone, their wealth vaporized, and their beloved daughter having just publicly executed whatever remained of their reputation. The room held its breath. The silence was heavy, expectant, and entirely mine to command. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders as I prepared to deliver the final, inescapable blow. The focal point of my attention pulled away from the crumpled silk of Jasmine's ruined gown and snapped sharply onto the woman standing just behind her. Beatrice Jackson, my mother. The immaculately groomed socialite who had spent 30 years cultivating an aura of untouchable grace was rapidly dissolving into a portrait of absolute ruin. Black mascara, thick and heavy, cut jagged rivers down her pale cheeks, staining her flawless complexion. The imported emerald fabric of her gown, usually a symbol of her reigning status, now clung to her trembling frame like a wet shroud. She stared at me, her chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. She realized that Desmond's aggressive rage had completely failed. She realized that Jasmine's frantic, desperate betrayal had failed. The walls of her meticulously curated empire were collapsing, and there was only one card left to play in the Jackson family deck. It was the ultimate universal weapon of toxic households everywhere. Beatrice took a trembling step forward, her hands outstretched, her palms open in a desperate pantomime of maternal warmth. "Zuri," She began, her voice cracking into a high, fragile pitch that grated against the silent room. "Zuri, baby, please." I watched the performance with a chilling detachment. The term of endearment sounded completely foreign coming from her lips. It was a word she had never used when I was growing up, a word she had reserved exclusively for the golden child currently weeping at my feet. "You cannot do this to us!" Beatrice cried out, stepping over Jasmine as if her eldest daughter were nothing more than a discarded rug. "You cannot throw us out on the street. This is your home. We are your family. I am your mother." Her voice rose, echoing off the vaulted ceiling, thick with a practiced, desperate agony. She was looking around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy guests, trying to rally an audience that had already turned their backs on her. "I carried you," Beatrice sobbed, clutching her chest. "I gave you life. You know how hard we worked to build this life for you girls. We sacrificed everything to put food on this table. We made mistakes. Yes, we are not perfect, but we are flesh and blood. You cannot kick your own parents out of their house." She took another step toward me, her hands clasping together in a pleading gesture. She turned her gaze to the side, zeroing in on the clergyman standing near the front of the crowd. "You are a Christian woman, Zuri!" Beatrice wailed, weaponizing her final line of defense. "You were raised in the church. Pastor Thomas is standing right here watching you. You know what the Bible says. You have to honor your mother and your father. You have to forgive us. We are family, and family forgives." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the suffocating silence of the grand foyer. I did not blink. I did not soften. I let her desperate, manipulating echoes fade completely into the cold marble walls before I allowed myself to speak. I took one deliberate step toward her, my posture rigidly straight. I was no longer the outcast daughter begging for scraps of affection. I was the executioner she had created. "Let us be perfectly clear about what you gave me." "Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath. "You did not give me life. You tried to starve me out of it." Beatrice flinched, shrinking back slightly, but I did not stop. "You gave me a roof, but you made sure I knew exactly what it cost you every single day." I continued, my words slicing through her facade like a scalpel. "You gave me food, but you seasoned it with a constant, suffocating stream of criticism. You demanded my absolute perfection, not to nurture my potential, but so you could parade me in front of your country club friends like a well-trained show pony. You never loved me as a daughter. You only valued me as an asset, and the second I stopped conforming to your perfect image, you turned me into an enemy." I took another slow step forward, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. "And when I refused to be your prop, when I started asking questions about where the charity money was actually going, you did not act like a mother," I said, my tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You acted like a mob boss. You and Desmond sat in your private study and actively conspired to frame your own daughter for a felony. You used my name to protect a lie." Pastor Thomas let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head in quiet revulsion as the depth of my parents' depravity was laid bare. Sterling Davis stood silently at my side, his presence a towering pillar of corporate and legal authority, watching me dismantle my mother's final defense. "You were perfectly willing to let me go to federal prison," I stated, raising my voice so the entire room could hear the truth. "You were going to let me take the fall for Jasmine's stolen wardrobe and your stolen country club fees. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood to cover up the fact that you were using scholarship funds to pay for your imported Italian marble and your luxury vacations. That is your version of family loyalty." Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, but her words died in her throat. She had no defense. The ledger in my hands and the terrified confession of her eldest daughter had stripped away every possible lie. "Do not dare weaponize my faith against me," I commanded, my tone turning to absolute ice. "Do not stand there draped in stolen diamonds and quote scripture to me. You sat in the front pew of Pastor Thomas's church every Sunday, smiling for the congregation, and then you went home and stole the futures of Black teenagers who trusted you. You robbed the very community you claimed to uplift, and you did it with a smile on your face." I looked directly into her terrified, running eyes, delivering the final crushing blow. "You want grace. You want absolution," I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Forgiveness is between you and God, Beatrice. I am here for the audit." The finality of those words struck her like a physical attack. She let out a choked gasp, her legs finally giving out as she slumped back against the Roman pillar, sliding down the stone until she was sitting on the floor next to her sobbing golden child. The Jackson dynasty was officially dead. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the undeniable reality of their total destruction. I turned my head slightly, looking toward the massive double oak doors at the entrance of the estate. I raised my right hand high into the air. I snapped my fingers. The heavy double oak doors at the entrance of the estate swung open with a resounding synchronized thud. 6 men and women dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits marched into the grand foyer. They were Vanguard Financial's corporate security, and their presence instantly changed the atmosphere of the room, from a ruined gala to an active crime scene. The lead security officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man, stepped past the stunned guests and handed me a thick stack of manila envelopes. I took them without a word and tossed them onto the marble floor directly at my parents' feet. They landed with a heavy, definitive slap. "Inside those envelopes are your immediate eviction notices," I stated, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "You have exactly 30 minutes to vacate these premises. You will also find cease and desist orders explicitly barring you from contacting any board members, bank officials, or employees associated with Jackson Real Estate Holdings." Desmond stared at the envelopes as if they were venomous snakes. Beatrice let out a soft, whimpering noise, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The high society guests, the politicians, the real estate moguls, and the megachurch pastors watched in absolute paralyzed silence. "I am not done," I told them, stepping closer. "The trust owns the estate, but it also owns the lifestyle you have been parading around in. I want the keys. Now." Desmond blinked, his face ashen. "The keys to what?" "The keys to the estate." I clarified my tone, leaving zero room for negotiation. "The fobs for the corporate Mercedes and the Porsche sitting in the driveway. And I want the black corporate credit cards. All of them." "Empty your pockets, Desmond, and you too, Jasmine." I turned my attention briefly to my sister, who was still kneeling on the floor. "Hand over the card." The sheer indignity of the moment hung thick in the air. For 35 years, Desmond and Beatrice Jackson had reigned supreme over this city. They had thrown this lavish anniversary gala to cement their legacy, surrounded by the wealthiest people in the state. Now, under the blinding glare of their own crystal chandeliers, they were being stripped bare. Desmond's hands shook violently as he reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out his sleek leather wallet and fumbled with it, his fingers betraying his complete loss of control. He slid 2 heavy metal credit cards out and dropped them onto the floor next to the envelopes. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a heavy ring of keys, tossing them down beside the cards. Beatrice was weeping openly now. She opened her imported designer clutch, the fabric catching her tears, and pulled out her own matching corporate cards and keys. She dropped them with a sharp clatter. Jasmine crawled forward slightly, unlatching a small silk purse. She pulled out a platinum card and set it down her shoulders, shaking with fresh, silent sobs. She had nothing. No husband, no trust fund, no car, and no home. The lead security officer stepped forward and gathered the items from the marble floor. "You will be escorted to the master suite to pack 1 bag of personal clothing each," I instructed them. "You may not take jewelry, artwork, or any items purchased using corporate funds. You have half an hour. After that, you will be escorted off the property. If you refuse to leave, the police will be called to remove you for trespassing." The security team moved in, forming a tight perimeter around my parents and sister. Desmond slowly helped Beatrice to her feet. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in the span of 10 minutes. He did not look at me. He did not look at the guests. He kept his eyes glued to the floor as the corporate security team marched the former king and queen of Atlanta real estate toward the sweeping staircase. Jasmine followed blindly behind them, a broken shadow of the golden child. The crowd parted for them in dead silence, watching the mighty Jackson family take their final humiliating walk. While the entire room was captivated by the sheer spectacle of my parents' downfall, another rat was attempting to quietly desert the sinking ship. Connor Jasmine's prestigious Wall Street husband had been slowly inching his way backward ever since Sterling Davis announced the bank's takeover. Connor was a coward, but he was a calculating one. He knew that the missing $50,000 and the corporate fraud meant federal audits, and federal audits meant the authorities would start looking very closely at his own offshore accounts and the money he had helped launder through Jasmine. As the security team marched my family up the stairs, Connor saw his window. He slipped through the archway leading toward the back terrace, moving with urgent, silent speed. He bypassed the main ballroom, cutting through the catering kitchen and out the side service doors, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the Jackson estate as possible. He jogged down the dimly lit stone path that wrapped around the side of the mansion, heading straight for the valet stand at the front gates. He reached into his pocket, gripping his valet ticket, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He just needed his car. He could make it to the airport, book a flight out of the country, and let the Jacksons burn to the ground on their own. He rounded the corner of the tall, manicured hedges, stepping out onto the brightly lit cobblestone driveway. Valet Connor snapped, waving his ticket frantically in the air. "Bring my car around right now." But the young men in the red valet vests were standing perfectly still, their hands raised slightly in the air. The driveway was not empty. 4 dark, unmarked SUVs were parked at sharp angles, blocking the exit entirely. 6 men and 2 women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters stamped across the back stepped out of the shadows. The letters spelled FBI. Connor froze, the valet ticket slipping from his fingers and fluttering to the cobblestone. My anonymous report to the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier that week, complete with a beautifully organized digital trail of Connor's embezzlement, had moved much faster than he anticipated. A tall agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Connor Bradley," the agent said, his voice cutting through the cool night air. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and money laundering. Put your hands behind your back." Connor took a sharp step backward, raising his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. A nervous, condescending laugh tumbled from his lips. He tried to project the untouchable confidence of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. He straightened his expensive silk tie, adopting the patronizing tone he usually reserved for waiters and junior analysts. "There has clearly been a massive misunderstanding," Connor said, flashing a brilliant, utterly fake smile. "You boys have the wrong guy. I am a senior vice president at a major firm. My father is a federal judge. I am currently attending a private charity gala. You do not just ambush people like me on a Tuesday night. I suggest you call your supervisor before you make a career-ending mistake." The lead agent did not blink. He did not smile. He simply reached forward, grabbed Connor by the wrist, and spun him around with ruthless, practiced efficiency. The sound of metal ratcheting tight against bone echoed across the cobblestone. "Your father has already been notified." The agent stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He was the one who provided us with your offshore account routing numbers to secure his own immunity. You are entirely on your own, Mr. Bradley. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." The sheer, absolute terror washed over Connor's face, shattering his arrogant shield of privilege into a million jagged pieces. His knees buckled slightly. The realization that his money, his connections, and his bloodline could not save him was a physical blow. He began to stammer, his voice rising in panic, as 2 agents shoved him roughly toward the open door of the black SUV. He demanded his lawyer. He demanded a phone call. He shouted that he was being framed. Nobody listened. Inside the grand estate, I turned away from the pathetic display unfolding in the foyer. The Vanguard security team was still systematically corralling my parents toward the sweeping marble staircase. I walked slowly across the imported flooring, my heels clicking in a steady, unbothered rhythm. I reached out and picked up a crystal glass of sparkling water from a deserted catering tray. I moved deliberately toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the front driveway. The heavy velvet drapes were pulled back, giving me a perfect, unobstructed view of the crisp night air. Down below, the heavy oak doors of the mansion suddenly burst open. Jasmine had somehow broken away from her security escort. She dashed out into the night, her ruined designer gown trailing behind her like a dirty rag. She thought Connor was her last lifeline. She thought she could jump into the passenger seat of his sports car and speed away from the financial slaughterhouse I had just constructed. Instead, she collided headfirst with the reality of flashing red and blue lights. Jasmine stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the federal agents swarming the driveway. She saw Connor, her meal ticket, her status symbol, and her ultimate shield being forced into the back of a federal squad car. A guttural, hysterical scream ripped from her throat. She sprinted across the cobblestone, waving her arms wildly, begging the agents to stop. "Connor!" Jasmine shrieked, clawing at the window of the SUV. "Connor, tell them to stop! Tell them you did nothing wrong! You have to help me! My parents have nothing! We have to leave!" Connor twisted his head to look at her through the glass. There was no love in his eyes. There was no protective instinct. There was only the raw, toxic hatred of a cornered rat. He glared at the woman he had married for her perceived wealth and status. "You did this to me," Connor screamed back at her, his voice muffled but entirely audible through the thick glass. "You told me the accounts were clean. You said your father had the auditors in his pocket. You stupid, useless woman. I am going to prison because of you." The agent slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off Connor's frantic accusations. The engine roared to life. Jasmine dropped to her knees on the hard stone, wailing into the night sky as the caravan of federal vehicles pulled away, taking her freedom, her marriage, and her future with them. She was left kneeling in the cold, clutching her empty hands, completely and utterly abandoned by the man she thought made her superior to everyone else. I stood behind the thick, soundproof glass of the ballroom window, watching the taillights fade into the distance. I lifted the crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of sparkling water. The carbonation danced lightly on my tongue. The contrast was absolute. Outside, my sister was screaming in the dirt, her life reduced to loud, frantic, chaotic destruction. Inside, I was surrounded by quiet, earned power. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to throw a tantrum. I had dismantled an entire dynasty with paper patience and absolute precision. I had spent my entire life being told I was unworthy because I refused to conform to their loud, flashy brand of toxic loyalty. They had built a kingdom on sand and theft, masking their rot with designer clothes and country club memberships. I had built my empire in the dark, brick by brick, studying their weaknesses while they underestimated my intelligence. They thought power was something you inherited. I proved that power was something you executed. I took one final refreshing sip of water and turned back around to face the interior of the ballroom. The security detail had managed to guide Beatrice halfway up the grand staircase. She was sobbing into her hands, barely able to support her own weight. But Desmond was not moving. He stood at the base of the stairs, breathing heavily, his chest expanding and contracting like a cornered bull. He had just watched his legacy vanish. He had watched his assets get legally seized. He had watched his son-in-law arrested by federal agents, and he could hear the faint, echoing screams of his golden child outside the front doors. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. The psychological snap of a narcissist losing total control is a dangerous thing. Desmond's eyes locked onto mine across the massive expanse of the ballroom. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. The realization that I, the daughter he had thrown away, was the architect of his total ruin, broke his mind completely. With a guttural, terrifying roar, Desmond shoved the nearest security officer backward and charged directly across the marble floor, lunging straight for my throat. The visual of his charge was sudden and violently explosive, a blur of red-faced fury and desperate momentum. But he did not make it 3 steps. The Vanguard corporate security team was not a collection of hired event bouncers. They were highly trained professionals, and they moved with terrifying silent efficiency. Before Desmond could even raise his hands toward me, 2 massive guards intercepted him. The lead officer grabbed Desmond by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo, using my father's own reckless momentum against him. With a brutal, practiced twist of his hips, the guard slammed Desmond face first into the polished marble floor. The impact was a sickening hollow crack of bone and expensive fabric meeting unforgiving stone. Desmond let out a choked gasp, the air driven completely from his lungs. A second guard immediately dropped his knee squarely between my father's shoulder blades, pinning him effortlessly to the ground. Desmond thrashed like a wild animal caught in a steel snare. His custom-tailored jacket ripped loudly along the seam. The crisp white fabric of his dress shirt smeared with the dust of the floor. He kicked his legs, his imported leather shoes scrambling and slipping uselessly against the smooth marble. He was completely immobilized, trapped beneath the physical weight of the corporate power he had foolishly tried to outsmart, but his mouth was still working. He twisted his neck, pressing his cheek flat against the cold stone, just so he could look at me. His face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated hatred, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You are a monster!" Desmond screamed, spit flying from his lips and dotting the marble. "You are a cold, heartless sociopath. You care more about a dead woman's bank accounts than you do about living, breathing people." I watched him struggle, my expression entirely blank. I did not step back. I did not flinch. "You will die lonely!" Desmond roared, his voice cracking under the strain of his own violent rage. "Do you hear me, Zuri? You will die completely alone in this massive empty house. No amount of money is ever going to buy you a husband who can stand you. No one will ever love you because you are toxic. You are poison. You destroyed your own blood." His words echoed through the grand foyer, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and raining down on the silent, horrified guests. The politicians, the real estate developers, and the high society elite who had spent the last decade kissing his ring now shrank back in absolute revulsion. They were witnessing the complete psychological collapse of a man they had once considered a peer. He had lost his money, his status, and now he had lost the very last shred of his dignity. I listened to his venomous rant until he finally ran out of breath. I slowly lowered my crystal glass of sparkling water onto a nearby silver catering tray. The soft clink of the glass against the metal rang out like a gavel striking a sound block. I walked toward him, the steady rhythmic clicking of my heels commanding the absolute silence of the room. I stopped just inches from his thrashing body. I looked down at the man who had spent 3 decades making me feel like an outcast, a burden, a secondary citizen in my own life. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of a woman who had already won the war. "Nana Josephine saw exactly who you were 18 years ago," I stated, ensuring every single syllable landed with surgical precision. "You destroyed your own blood. I just read the receipt." Desmond froze. The fight completely drained out of his body. The raw, undeniable truth of my words stripped away his last remaining illusion of control. He was not a victim. He was a thief caught in a trap he had built with his own 2 hands. I gave a brief, sharp nod to the security chief. The guards hauled Desmond to his feet. He did not struggle anymore. He hung limply in their grip, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped forward. He looked like a hollow, defeated shell of the patriarch he had pretended to be just an hour prior. Across the foyer, 2 other guards pulled Beatrice away from the grand staircase. Her hysterical sobbing had reduced to a pathetic, rhythmic wheezing. She reached out a trembling hand toward Desmond, seeking comfort from a man who had none left to give. "Move them out," the security chief ordered. They marched my parents toward the grand entrance. The same towering oak doors they had opened hours earlier to welcome Atlanta's elite were now the doors of their permanent exile. The heavy wood swung wide, revealing the crisp, cold night air, and the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles still processing Connor down in the driveway. The security team pushed Desmond and Beatrice over the threshold. They did not look back. They stepped out into the darkness, stripped of their titles, their wealth, and their pride. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them with a resounding, permanent thud. The grand foyer was instantly plunged into a stunned, breathless silence. The sudden absence of my family left a massive vacuum in the room. I stood completely alone in the center of the imported marble floor, the overhead chandeliers casting a brilliant warm light across my shoulders. Slowly, the gaze of every single person in the room turned toward me. The sycophants, the investors, the mega church pastors, and the socialites. They had come to this gala tonight to honor Desmond and Beatrice Jackson. They had come to drink their champagne and bask in their stolen wealth. But they were apex predators themselves, and they instantly recognized the shift in the ecosystem. They were no longer looking at an outcast daughter. They were looking at the sole owner of the estate, the chairman of the board, and the undisputed master of the empire. Sterling Davis stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, adjusting his suit jacket, and gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. The rest of the room followed suit, waiting in absolute silence for my first command. The massive custom-carved oak doors at the main entrance of the estate did not simply open. They were thrown wide with a sudden violent force that sent a shockwave through the dead silence of the grand foyer. The visual reality of the room instantly fractured into a chaotic, unsteady blur. The immaculately dressed guests gasped and scrambled backward, their champagne flutes trembling as an elite team of corporate security operatives marched through the entryway. There were 8 of them in total, dressed in sharp, identical dark suits, moving with a cold, synchronized precision that felt entirely out of place in a ballroom. They did not look at the crystal chandeliers or the floral arrangements. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose, cutting a direct path straight through the sea of Atlanta's highest society. The lead officer, a towering man with a severe expression, stopped directly in front of me. He carried a thick, heavy stack of manila folders. Without a single word, he handed them over. I took the heavy files, feeling the weight of 30 years of justice resting in my palms. I turned my attention back to the 3 people cowering near the base of the Roman pillar. I stepped forward and tossed the first 3 folders onto the marble floor. They landed with a sharp, definitive slap right at Desmond's expensive leather shoes. "Inside those envelopes are your immediate eviction notices," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the room. "You no longer own this property. You no longer possess the right to reside here. You have exactly 30 minutes to gather 1 suitcase each of basic personal clothing. Furthermore, you are officially served with immediate cease and desist orders. You are legally barred from contacting any board members, bank officials, or employees associated with Jackson Real Estate Holdings. Your access to the corporate servers has already been terminated." Desmond stared down at the manila envelopes as if they were live explosives. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that absolutely refused to come. Beside him, Beatrice let out a low, agonizing wail, burying her face into her hands as the reality of her total destruction finally set in. "But I was not finished. The trust owns this estate," I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, unyielding register. "But the trust also owns the completely fraudulent lifestyle you have been parading around in. I want the keys. Now." Desmond blinked his eyes, darting frantically around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face among his peers. He found none. The politicians, the wealthy developers, and the megachurch pastors were watching his execution in total, paralyzed silence. "The keys to what?" Desmond rasped, his voice barely a hollow whisper. "The keys to the estate," I clarified, stepping even closer so he could see the absolute finality in my eyes. "The fobs for the corporate Mercedes and the Porsche currently sitting in the driveway. And I want the black corporate credit cards. All of them." "Empty your pockets, Desmond." The sheer absolute indignity of the demand hung heavy over the room. For 35 years, Desmond and Beatrice Jackson had reigned supreme. They had used their wealth and influence to intimidate, control, and manipulate everyone around them. Now, under the blinding glare of their own anniversary gala, they were being publicly stripped of their armor. "Do it," I commanded. Desmond's hands shook violently as he reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out his sleek designer wallet and fumbled with the leather, his fingers betraying his complete loss of control. He slid 2 heavy metal credit cards out and dropped them onto the floor. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a heavy ring of keys, tossing them down beside the cards. The metal clattered loudly against the stone. Beatrice wept openly, her shoulders heaving as she opened her imported clutch. She pulled out her own matching corporate cards and keys, dropping them with a sharp, pathetic thud. Jasmine crawled forward slightly. She unlatched her small silk purse and pulled out a platinum card, setting it down on the marble. Her chest hitched with fresh, silent sobs. She had nothing left. No husband to protect her, no trust fund to fall back on, no company car, and no home. The lead security officer stepped forward, sweeping the keys and cards up from the floor. "You will be escorted to the master suite," I instructed them, my voice echoing loudly for the entire room to hear. "You may pack basic necessities. You may not take jewelry, artwork, or any luxury items purchased using corporate funds. After 30 minutes, you will be escorted off the property. If you refuse to leave, the police will be called to physically remove you for trespassing." The security team moved in immediately, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around my parents and my sister. Desmond slowly helped Beatrice to her feet. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in the span of 10 minutes. He kept his eyes glued to the floor as the corporate guards marched the former king and queen of Atlanta real estate toward the sweeping staircase. Jasmine followed blindly behind them, a broken, empty shadow of the golden child she used to be. The crowd parted for them in dead silence, watching the mighty Jackson dynasty take their final humiliating walk. But while the entire room was captivated by the sheer spectacle of my parents' downfall, another rat was attempting to quietly desert the sinking ship. Connor, Jasmine's prestigious Wall Street husband, had been slowly inching his way backward ever since the audit was announced. Connor was a coward, but he was a highly calculating one. He knew that the missing funds and the corporate fraud meant federal audits, and federal audits meant the authorities would start looking very closely at his own offshore accounts. He knew his role in laundering the stolen charity money through Jasmine was about to be exposed. As the security team marched my family up the stairs, Connor saw his window of opportunity. He slipped through the stone archway leading toward the back terrace, moving with urgent, silent speed. He bypassed the main ballroom entirely, cutting through the busy catering kitchen and shoving past the startled waitstaff. He pushed out the side service doors, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the Jackson estate as physically possible. He jogged heavily down the dimly lit stone path that wrapped around the side of the mansion, heading straight for the valet stand at the front gates. He reached into his pocket, his fingers tightly gripping his valet ticket, his chest heaving with sharp spikes of adrenaline. He just needed his car. If he could get his car, he could make it to the airport, book an international flight, and let the Jacksons burn to the ground on their own. He rounded the corner of the tall, manicured hedges, stepping out onto the brightly lit cobblestone driveway. Valet Connor snapped, waving his ticket frantically in the air. "Bring my car around right now. I am in a massive hurry." But the young men in the red valet vests were standing perfectly still, their hands raised slightly in the air, their faces pale with shock. The driveway was not empty. 4 dark, unmarked SUVs were parked at sharp, aggressive angles, blocking the exit gates entirely. 6 men and 2 women, wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters stamped across the back, stepped out of the shadows. The letters spelled FBI. Connor froze in his tracks. The valet ticket slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering softly down to the cold cobblestone. My anonymous report to the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier that week, complete with a beautifully organized digital trail of Connor's embezzlement, had moved much faster than he ever anticipated. A tall federal agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Connor Bradley," the agent said, his voice cutting through the cool night air like a blade. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and money laundering." The roar of the ballroom, the thunderous applause of the community leaders, and the frantic, chaotic downfall of the Jackson Empire all fade away into a soft, ambient quiet. The camera transitions, pulling me out of the memory of that spectacular night. I am sitting in my favorite velvet armchair, the morning sunlight pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my own living room. The camera starts on a tight, intimate close-up of my face. The tension is gone. The rigid, cold armor of the executioner I had to become has completely melted away. My expression is soft, unbothered, and profoundly peaceful. As the camera begins a slow, deliberate dolly out, the true scope of my sanctuary is revealed. It is a beautiful, expansive home filled with natural light, thriving green plants, and carefully curated artwork. There are no stolen Roman pillars. There are no fraudulent crystal chandeliers purchased with stolen charity funds. Everything in this house is real. Everything here is earned. Everything here is mine. It has been exactly 6 months since the Vanguard security team escorted my family out of their stolen empire. 6 months since the truth was laid bare for the entire city of Atlanta to see. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. Justice, I have learned, moves with terrifying speed when the paper trail is absolutely flawless. Let us start with Connor, the arrogant Wall Street titan who thought he could use my name and my signature to launder his stolen money, is currently serving a 72-month sentence in a federal correctional facility. His expensive lawyers tried desperately to negotiate a plea deal, but the sheer volume of digital evidence I handed over to the SEC left them with absolutely zero leverage. He traded his custom-tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. His offshore accounts have been seized, his assets liquidated, and his pristine reputation completely obliterated. He is a nobody sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of the white privilege that once made him untouchable. Without Connor's fraudulent income and without the Jackson Trust Fund to bleed dry, Jasmine experienced a catastrophic collision with the real world. The golden child who once sneered at anyone she deemed beneath her social tax bracket is currently working 40 hours a week at a high-end retail boutique in Buckhead. She is doing it just to make the minimum monthly payments on her staggering credit card debt. I have been told she spends her days folding the exact same designer clothes she used to buy by the dozen. She serves the exact same socialites who used to attend her lavish parties, women who now whisper behind her back and pretend they do not recognize her. Her luxury SUVs were repossessed, her country club membership was publicly revoked, and her perfect curated life dissolved into a pathetic cautionary tale of entitlement and greed. As for Beatrice and Desmond, their destruction was the most poetic of all. The bank seized everything to cover the embezzled charity funds and the outstanding corporate debts. The luxury cars, the imported furniture, the vacation homes, all of it was gone in a matter of days. They now live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. For 35 years, my parents worshipped at the altar of public perception. They sacrificed their own daughter just to maintain a fragile facade of perfection. Now the high society community they cared so much about has completely turned its back on them. The megachurch pastors do not return their calls. The real estate moguls pretend they never existed. The charity boards have scrubbed their names from every plaque and website. They are social pariahs trapped in a tiny rented space with nothing but each other and the crushing, suffocating weight of their own failures. They traded their souls for an empire, and in the end, they lost both. I slowly turn my head, my eyes settling on the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace. Resting in the center is a beautifully framed silver photograph of Nana Josephine. Her sharp, knowing eyes stare back at me, a gentle smile playing on her lips. She always saw the truth. She saw the rot festering behind my parents' perfect smiles, and she tried to protect me the only way she knew how. She gave me the tools, the education, and the legal authority to dismantle their corruption. I look at her photograph and realize a fundamental truth that took me 30 years to finally understand. Blood does not make a family. Shared DNA is nothing but a biological accident, a roll of the genetic dice. True family is built on a foundation of unshakable loyalty, absolute truth, and mutual respect. My parents demanded blind obedience and called it love. They demanded silent suffering and called it loyalty. They wanted me to be a scapegoat, a sacrificial lamb for their vanity. I had to amputate my own flesh and blood just to save my own life, and standing here today in the quiet warmth of my own home, I do not regret a single second of it. I reach over to the small oak-side table and pick up my porcelain teacup. The warm, fragrant steam rises gently in the morning light. I take a slow, comforting sip, letting the quiet serenity of the moment wash over me completely. I lower the cup and look directly into the camera lens, allowing a small knowing, an entirely genuine smile to curve my lips. They tried to tell the world I was a thief. I say, my voice steady, calm, and absolute. They forgot that when you force someone to survive in the dark, they learn exactly where all the skeletons are buried.